All right, hi everyone. Go ahead and get started. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Wesson. I am the Events and Communications Specialist at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, or CLTC for short. At CLTC, our mission focuses on the future of digital security and expanding who participates in cybersecurity. And a big part of that mission is focused on the global security and policy implications for artificial intelligence, which is why we're all here today. So it's my pleasure to welcome you to our event today that we are co-hosting along with the AI Policy Hub at UC Berkeley. It is my pleasure to hand things over to CLTC's Jessica Newman, who is the director for the AI Security Initiative at CLTC and co-director of the AI Policy Hub. So Jess, I'll pass it over to you.
Thanks, Rachel. And hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the first annual UC Berkeley AI Policy Research Symposium. I'm Jessica Newman, one of the co-directors of the UC Berkeley AI Policy Hub, and I'm joined by our other co-director, Brandy Noneke. We launched the AI Policy Hub a year ago with the ambition of fostering an interdisciplinary initiative at UC Berkeley to support annual cohorts of graduate researchers who are passionate about safe and equitable AI. The AI Policy Hub is housed at the AI Security Initiative, which is part of the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, or CLTC, and at the CITRIS Policy Lab, which is part of the Center for Information Technology Research in the Interest of Society and the Banatao Institute, otherwise known as CITRIS. We are so grateful to CLTC and CITRIS for all of their support of this initiative. We also want to thank our generous funders and the many other centers and departments across campus that we collaborate with. It really is a wonderful community that spans much of UC Berkeley. The need for AI policy has only become more critical since we first launched this program. There are a growing number of calls from across sectors to put much more robust standards and regulations around AI systems that pose profound risks to individuals and society and are already being abused. Even simple algorithmic systems can cause significant harm when they're used to make decisions that alter people's lives. But increasingly, AI systems have also become generators of new content, code, language, images, audio, with dramatic impacts on the work of developers, writers, artists, musicians, as well as many others. Some of these AI systems are being widely deployed and even being given the ability to take actions on their own, despite significant limitations and vulnerabilities. We believe that governing AI technologies is one of the most important challenges facing humanity today, and that we need as many people working on these challenges from as many backgrounds and areas of expertise as possible. Our mission is to cultivate an interdisciplinary research community to anticipate and address policy opportunities for safe and beneficial AI. To us, this means we have to investigate what is happening today from a broad perspective, looking at the intersections of the technical, political, societal, legal, and ethical dimensions, while also looking over the horizon to ensure policies are not out of date by the time they are enacted. The fellows who comprise this first cohort of the AI Policy Hub are joining us today, and we are excited to introduce you to them and highlight their fascinating and important work, which covers multiple different cutting-edge AI policy debates. These range from improving the ability to interrogate and explain AI systems, to understanding how recommender systems can be incentivized to manipulate users, to fighting back against the pervasive surveillance facilitated by AI technologies, to improving the remedy of algorithmic disgorgement. It has been a joy working with the 6 remarkable AI Policy Hub fellows throughout this past academic year, and we are confident their work will continue to impact AI policy decisions for many years to come. We are also deeply honored to have 2 distinguished keynote presentations today by Professors Stuart Russell and Pamela Samuelson. These 2 UC Berkeley faculty members are not only incredibly supportive advisors to the AI Policy Hub, but also pioneers in both the technical and legal dimensions of AI technologies. Our first keynote speaker who will be starting off our event today is Stuart Russell. Stuart is a professor of computer science at UC Berkeley, holder of the Smith-Zadeh Chair in Engineering, and director of the Center for Human Compatible AI and the Kavli Center for Ethics, Science, and the Public. In 2021, he received the OBE from Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth. His book, Artificial Intelligence, A Modern Approach with Peter Norvig, is the standard text in AI, used in 1,500 universities in 135 countries. Now, unfortunately, Stuart is no longer able to be with us live for a very good reason you will hear more about shortly, but he has kindly recorded his presentation, which we will now play for you all.
Thank you very much for asking me to speak. I'm sorry I can't be there in person, and I also can't do a live Zoom connection to the meeting because I'm at the OECD in Paris, and we're having a small conclave whose purpose is to hammer out the final details of the language of the definition of artificial intelligence. So let's get straight into policy and AI, because the definition of AI actually determines what systems count as AI and will therefore be regulated under laws that are being proposed in the United States, where Charles Schumer, leader of the Senate, has announced that he will start drafting some regulations on AI, in the European Union, where the Artificial Intelligence Act has been undergoing the sausage-making process for more than 2 years, is expected to enter into force later on this year if all goes well, and even in China, which I'll talk about in a minute. So the definition really matters, and just to give you one example, the definition that has been used by the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, which is an international organization with all the advanced economies in the West being members of the OECD. And the documents that it produces are legal documents in the sense that the member states have to approve them and then abide by them, at least in a high-level sense going forward. So the definition from 2019 includes the idea that an AI system has to be built for, or has to be given human-defined objectives. But if you think about it, the large language models, such as ChatGPT, are not given human-defined objectives. They don't have planning capabilities. They're simply trained to imitate human beings, and there's no explicit objective whatsoever. So a good lawyer could probably argue that ChatGPT is not an AI system. And just for good measure, just in case, the tech company lobbyists in the European Union managed to insert a clause in the AI Act stating that for the purposes of this act, general purpose AI systems shall not be considered AI systems. So then they would be completely unregulated. So I think these examples point to the importance of policy, the difficulties in turning high-level principles, of which there are tons, more than 300 sets of principles have been issued by various organizations, including the University of California itself, on how AI systems should be designed and managed. But turning those principles into actual regulations with legal force is full of potholes, or it's a minefield, depending on how you look at it. And just to give you one example of what I think is an upcoming pothole, the United Kingdom has announced draft proposals for its legislative strategy on AI. And they insist that an AI system is a machine learning system. So all AI systems which are not machine learning, such as Deep Blue, which is the chess program that defeated Garry Kasparov, the navigation systems on your phone, many other kinds of systems would not be viewed as AI at all, which is obviously a weird thing. So systems based on reasoning, on theorem proving, on problem solving search. So about 2/3 of the chapters in the AI textbook are no longer AI according to the United Kingdom. But it also means that you could have a very strange situation where two identical systems, for example, if you use decision tree learning to produce a decision tree, that's perhaps a fairly simple one, then that's an AI system and it will be regulated. If a human being writes the same decision tree, which is entirely possible, or even looks at the output of a machine learning algorithm that produces decision trees, and then writes a similar decision tree or a piece of C++ code that basically implements that, then it would not be an AI system. So you've got essentially two identical software objects, one of which is going to be regulated and one of which is not. And this is a persistent misunderstanding, the difference between the method by which the AI system is constructed, which does have implications for example, how it should be checked, how its accuracy should be evaluated, what kinds of steps should be taken to ensure that the construction process is valid. And then the object itself, which is the thing that is the output of the construction process and is then going to be used in practice, going to be deployed, going to be sold, going to be incorporated into more complex products, and so on. Okay, so let me briefly mention the elephant in the room, which is obviously ChatGPT or GPT-4, the latest version, and the open letter that the Future of Life Institute promulgated a few weeks ago, and which I signed, although it's not a letter that I would have written, but I thought on balance it was a good idea to support the effort. The letter is asking for a pause in the training and release of systems more capable, more powerful than GPT-4. And GPT-4 itself, you could have a variety of opinions about how intelligent it is. It's very roughly, it's a trillion parameter system as far as we know. We don't actually know any details. Trained on maybe 20 or 30 trillion words, so equivalent to all of the books that the human race has produced in history. Essentially what you do is you take those trillion parameters, you make about 1 billion trillion small random perturbations to those parameters in the hope of making it better at predicting the next word in the sequence of words. And with a vast amount of training data, it seems to produce quite remarkable capabilities. And because it's basically a trillion parameter black box trained by 1 billion trillion perturbations, we actually have no idea how it works. And I've been fairly skeptical over the development of these large language models in the last few years about whether there is real reasoning or real, let's say, if you want to call it real intelligence, are the outputs being produced, as we say, for the right reasons? Or is it what some people call a stochastic parrot, or somewhere in between? It's most likely to be somewhere in between. But a group of researchers at Microsoft, including 2 members of the National Academies, several other very brilliant machine learning experts, spent several months working with GPT-4 specifically. So they, as a group, collectively probably have more experience working with GPT-4 than almost anyone else on Earth. And they wrote a paper summarizing their findings, and in the title, they talk about sparks of artificial general intelligence. And of course, AGI is arguably the long-term goal of the field, but is also the thing that Alan Turing predicted would result in the machines taking control. Because once you have machines that are more capable than human beings, it's rather hard for us to stop them doing whatever it is they want to do. So that leads to the question, okay, well, what do they want to do? Specifically, does GPT-4 develop internal goals, which is a very reasonable question, given that it's learning to imitate human beings, and particularly their linguistic behavior, and their linguistic behavior is for a purpose. So the goals of human beings affect, in a fairly direct way, the linguistic behavior that they generate, including my goal in giving this talk to you, for example, or my goals in giving this talk. So I asked the lead author of the Microsoft paper evaluating GPT-4 whether it had developed its own internal goals in order to try to imitate human beings better. And if so, what were those goals? And the answer was, we have no idea whatsoever. So you have a system that supposedly exhibits sparks of AGI that may or may not have its own internal goals, and it's being released, presumably to eventually hundreds of millions or billions of people, and it's completely unregulated. So, so the letter is basically asking, as far as I'm concerned, this is the way I've been explaining it to the media. Letter is really asking that the principles that all the major governments have already signed up to, for example, OECD Principle 1. For example, OECD Principle 1.4 says that AI systems should be robust, predictable, and we need to be able to show that they present no undue risk before they can be deployed. And it's hard to argue that systems like GPT-4 satisfy that, despite very considerable and commendable efforts by OpenAI to reduce the degree of bad behavior that it exhibits. It still does give unlicensed medical advice. It still, if you ask in the right way, will advise you on how to commit suicide or how to develop banned weapons and so on. So they've overall reduced the bad behavior by 29% compared to previous systems, basically by saying bad dog whenever it misbehaves. But that's not really a particularly reliable form of producing guaranteed safe systems, is to say bad dog. Imagine if we simply said bad dog to a nuclear power station every time it explodes. That's probably not the way you'd want to go about it. And interestingly, since the open letter was released, Charles Schumer, the leader of the Senate, has announced plans to regulate AI. OpenAI itself released a statement saying that they urged governments to regulate, to define and enforce safety criteria for AI systems. And China has issued a set of regulations that are probably stricter than anything under consideration in the US or in Europe, including the requirement that large language models not output false information. And as we know, they output false information all the time. So this is a de facto ban on large language models. And it may be revised during the comment period, but that's what it says. So regulations, I think, are necessary. And there's definitely pushback. Here at the OECD in Paris, there are representatives from the large tech companies who are arguing against any regulation, as perhaps one might expect. And there are many people pushing back on the idea that we need to worry about AGI, despite Microsoft's claim that GPT-4 is already starting to exhibit sparks of AGI. The idea that we should wait until AGI happens before we regulate it is quite common, but it seems to me analogous to waiting on developing the planetary defense system against asteroids until a large asteroid slams into the Earth, and then we develop the planetary defense system. No one thinks that's a good idea, and I don't see why anyone thinks it's a good idea to wait until AGI arrives and then think about how to regulate it, because it may, as Alan Turing predicted, be too late. So for all these reasons and many others, I think developing sensible policy around AI is extremely important. And I don't think one should underestimate the difficulty of that for policymakers who have absolutely no exposure to what AI is really about and how these systems work, who are often informed about it by lobbyists who have vested interests in the policymakers not really understanding what it's about. And it's also difficult for AI researchers who have no knowledge or experience in how policy should be created, what are the different kinds of regulatory tools that can be used. I think most AI researchers probably don't even think about the difference between legislation directly regulating AI and legislation that creates a regulatory agency with devolved powers for rulemaking, and which of those kinds of solutions would be best. So the many, many aspects of policy that I and most other AI researchers don't understand. But there's a huge opportunity, therefore, for people who understand both AI and policy, who have real, solid technical backgrounds in both of these areas to make a huge difference. And my feeling is that this is really a pivotal period. Probably should have started a few years ago in terms of really pushing on regulation. But I think, unfortunately, COVID did really interrupt that process. But we have time now to do it. There's a program called the AI 2050 program, which is based on the premise that, let's say the hypothesis that AI systems have developed successfully, that the human race has made the right policy decisions and is successfully coexisting with those very powerful AI systems that are contributing enormously to our flourishing civilization. So that's the hypothesis, that we could be in that state in 2050. And then the question is, what would we have to have done right to be in that situation? And I think we have to have done it right now and in the next few years. So this is a really important time to be thinking about and talking about AI policy. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Great. We're really grateful for Stuart's presentation, and we're really glad to know that he is working on a critical AI policy decision right now as we speak. Stuart highlighted some of the reasons it is so urgent to address the challenges facing AI development and deployment today, and why we need as many people and as many diverse people as possible working together on this. With that, we are very excited to now turn to the presentations from the AI Policy Hub Fellows. We will show a brief 5 to 7 minute video presentation from each of the fellows that were pre-recorded. And they are here joining us, and they will be able to answer any audience questions immediately after each presentation. So please put any questions you have for the fellows in the Q&A box, and they will answer them after their video presentation is finished. Our first presentation is from Alexander Asemota. Alex's research focuses on explainability in machine learning, and currently he is developing counterfactual methods that are useful for practitioners in industry. A graduate of Howard University, Alex was awarded a Chancellor's Fellowship during the first 2 years of his PhD training at UC Berkeley.
Hi everyone, my name is Alex. I'm a third year in the SES department, advised by Giles Hooker. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about my research, which is on leveraging longitudinal data to improve counterfactuals. So AI is increasingly used to make decisions in high-stakes context. For example, approving or denying someone for a loan, or choosing between treatment regimens. It's really important, and sometimes it's legally required, to explain individual decisions to people. But the problem is that AI systems use complicated models that no one may understand. The number of variables and parameters make traditional methods impractical and impossible. And even if the model developer understands the model, how would they explain those decisions to someone who has a background in AI? Counterfactual explanations are a promising solution to this problem. Counterfactuals answer the question, what if I had done X? For example, if I applied for a loan and I was denied, I may ask, if my income was $10,000 higher, would I have been accepted for the loan? In this framework, counterfactuals can act as a recommendation for what should have happened for you to receive the decision you wanted to have received. This formulation has a couple of strong benefits. First, it's understandable by people who have no background in AI. It's in general how people conceptualize feedback and improvement, and provides actionable feedback, tells someone specifically what to do to get the decision that they want to get. However, there are a couple of notable challenges. First, how do we provide reasonable recommendations? That is, recommendations that don't include difficult or impossible actions, such as changing your race. And then how do we rank the realism of recommendations? How do we tell which recommendations are more possible or more plausible for someone between different recommendations? So to sort of delve in this a little bit deeper, we have an example here. Let's suppose that I am a credit lender and I'm trying to decide who I should accept and deny for a line of credit. And my formula is pretty basic. I just divide their income by their age. And if that is greater than 1,000, I will give them the loan. If not, then I will deny them the loan. And so on the left, we have people who've been denied, and on the right, we have people who've been accepted. And then let's say we have to explain to person B why their application was denied. We may use counterfactuals to do this, and specifically, we may look for someone who was accepted for a loan that was relatively similar to the person who was denied. In this case, person D is most mathematically similar in distance to person B. That ends up with a recommendation that says, person B, you should reduce your age by 44 years and increase your income by 5,000 years. That, of course, is a nonsensical recommendation, and this showcases that if we only look at sort of the mathematical structure of the data, we don't really get any information on how likely a particular recommendation is for someone to achieve. This is where longitudinal data comes in. So longitudinal data is data that's observed over time. And with this type of data, we can see what changes have happened in reality and leverage that information to see how realistic a recommendation is. It's a trajectory that we can compare to observed data. So here we have the gray recommendation and the green recommendation, where in either one of them, the point is where the individual is starting, and the end of the arrow is where they would end up after completing this recommendation. In our method, what we do is we first collect trajectories that we've seen in observed data. And these may have sort of twists and turns because we may observe multiple data points within a certain time period. And then we simplify these trajectories to just the beginning and the end. And then once we have these simplified trajectories, we compare them to the recommendation that we have gotten from our counterfactual. And in these comparisons, we're looking for recommendations that have the most in common with the most observed changes in reality. And with that, we rank our recommendations. In this case, we would rank the green recommendation higher because it has more in common with more observed changes than the gray recommendation. So this has a couple of policy implications. First of all, organizations that use counterfactuals for explanations should compare the recommendations to observed changes. This improves the feasibility of recommendations, and it assists in differentiating between multiple different recommendations, so you can see which recommendations are more likely than others based on observed changes in the past. And though counterfactuals have significant potential, regulators really should scrutinize their use to make sure that they aren't violating existing regulations. And with that in mind, I've been working on a white paper directed at the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau addressing AI in explanations. The Consumer Finance Law requires that credit companies give individual explanations to applicants. And the CFPB has stated that companies that use AI for decisions have to adhere to regulations, but they haven't said specifically how they should be adhering to current regulations. My white paper recommends that the CFPB develop an explicit framework for AI, and that the framework should include aspects of relevance, reliability, and specificity, which would address some of the issues that we discussed earlier in the presentation. And that the CFPB should provide examples that are specific to the framework and that are acceptable and unacceptable under the guidelines of the framework. So that is my work. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alex. And a reminder to everybody, please put your questions in the Q&A box. I do have a question for you, Alex. In your demonstration of when sometimes people are selected for a loan or not selected for a loan, can you actually use counterfactuals to reveal discriminatory decision-making in some of these systems where a protected characteristic might be used to decide whether or not someone can or cannot get a loan?
Yeah, so if you use a sort of naive framework for counterfactuals where you just look at distances, that can bring out some of the sort of harmful associations that your model may be making. If you correct for them after, on the back end using this longitudinal setup, then in theory you shouldn't be seeing any of those types of explanations. But definitely, if you start off by looking at how your model relates these things in a mathematical distance, that could be useful for detecting bias and regulation violations.
Great, thank you so much, Alex. We're going to move on to our next presentation. I see some questions going into the Q&A box. Alex can see those, and he will be able to type the answer to your question. So our next presentation will be from Zoe Kahn. Zoe's research explores how AI and machine learning systems may result in unanticipated dynamics, including harms to people and society. She uses qualitative methods to understand the perspectives and experiences of impacted communities. She then leverages storytelling to influence the design of technical systems and the policies that surround its use. Zoe has conducted field work in rural communities in the United States, worked on issues of homelessness in the Bay Area, and is currently working on a project that uses data-intensive methods to allocate humanitarian aid to individuals experiencing extreme poverty in Togo. And Zoe is joining us right now from Togo, I believe. So let's go ahead with your presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Zoe Kahn. I am a Ph.D. candidate at the UC Berkeley School of Information, and I'm super excited to be sharing some of the work that I've been doing this year as part of my fellowship at the AI Policy Hub. And I'm super looking forward to the discussion that we're going to have and the question and answer session to follow. The work that I'll be talking about today really could not have been possible without my advisors, Jenna Burrell and Josh Blumenstock, as well as Emily Aiken, another PhD student at the iSchool, and our Togo-based research collaborator, Karel Pere. The work that I'm going to be talking about today is work that takes place in Togo, but before I get into the specifics of my research, I just want to spend a little bit of time talking about the more general research space. So governments are increasingly using machine learning models to make very important decisions about how resources will be allocated. Anything from who will receive housing to who will receive benefits to which areas will receive investments, and so on and so forth. And these approaches bring benefits, but there's been increasing attention being paid to the way in which they all too often unintentionally introduce harms to people, society, or the environment. And in response, there have been a variety of AI governance frameworks that have been calling on policymakers and technologists to really engage directly with the communities who are impacted, or people who have experiential expertise. And the hope is that by engaging directly with people who have experiential expertise, that the socio-technical systems will be designed in ways that really support the things that are important to people in their lives and don't accidentally introduce new issues or new problems or reify existing problems. So there's quite a bit of excitement right now in the tech policy space to really engage with these experiential experts, but there's actually very little in terms of methods for doing so. And one key challenge and the focus of the work that I'll be talking about today is thinking about how to explain complex data and machine learning algorithms to everyday people so that they can provide really meaningful input. So my research takes place in the small country of Togo, which is located next to Ghana in West Africa. And I'm actually in Togo right now. So here's a photo of what my life has been looking like for the last 6 weeks. And the work that I'm doing is specifically around a digital cash aid program in Togo that provided money entirely digitally. And this means that people registered for the program using their mobile phones. Eligibility for the program was done entirely digitally. And then people received money to their mobile phones via mobile money, which is sort of the equivalent of Venmo or PayPal, but it works on basic feature phones. And given that this fellowship is around AI, I wanted to just spend a moment to talk about the machine learning component. So the criteria that was used to determine who would receive money from this program and who would not was based on a machine learning model that used mobile phone metadata. And mobile phone metadata is basically information that is routinely recorded by mobile network operators about things like phone calls, text messages, mobile money transactions, so on and so forth. And so the algorithms were actually developed by Josh Blumenstock and his research team, and then were used by the government of Togo as a way of deciding who would receive money from this program and who would not. So there's quite a bit of conversation taking place right now in the West around the use of mobile phone metadata, both in this program specifically, but also much more generally for this application and other applications. And in this work, what we were really interested in understanding was the perspectives and experiences of people living in rural Togo, the people whose data was used, the people who are really impacted by this particular program. And these are often people who have no technical training, often, little to no formal education and varying levels of literacy. And in what we found in this work is that in order to, in order for us to get the input and allow people in rural Togo to weigh in, we needed some way to provide participants with an effective mental model about the data that's recorded by mobile phone operators, as well as an intuition for how that information could be used to identify people in their community who are wealthier and people in their community who are poorer. And so to do this, what we ended up developing was a visual aid. And so here is a photo of the visual aid. And basically, we use these different visuals as a way to explain to people about the information that's recorded by mobile network operators, as well as sort of how that information could be used to identify who in the community is wealthier and who is poorer. So you can see here, like we have a person and a phone and a SIM card to start to represent sort of information about that's recorded on SIM cards. You can also see over here that that we have a money icon to represent mobile money records and mobile money transactions, and then a map over here and some cell phone towers to start to understand information recorded about location. I'm not going to go into details about this, but happy to talk more about it in the question and answer session. And what was super interesting to me is that not only was the visual aid really useful as a way of providing people with an explanation, but also that participants just took up elements of the visual aid during the interviews, both as a way of answering our questions, but also as a way of articulating their own ideas in new and interesting ways. And so I just want to end by taking a step back and talking a little bit more broadly about what I hope that the policymaking community will do with this work. And really what my hope is that the methods that we have developed in Togo can be taken up more broadly and used as a way to really meaningfully engage people with experiential expertise who have really diverse lived experiences, people who may not have technical training, people who may not have, little to no formal education, and also to be able to engage people in settings that are very low tech. These are printouts that were laminated. They don't require connectivity. They don't require familiarity with any digital technology. And the final point that I want to make is that not only do these methods enable policymakers to engage in what I'd call like good governance, but in my experience doing this work in Togo, it really is a way to treat people with dignity. And that's the final point that I want to end with. And thank you so much. And I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we'll have in the question and answer session. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much, Zoe. I have a question about how you develop the visual aids. How do you best validate that the visual aids you're developing actually ring true and there's this understanding in the community?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Brandy. So part of the visual aid in terms of developing it was a really collaborative experience between myself, Emily Aiken, and our Togo-based research partner, Corel Pere. And I think each of us played a pretty critical role there. So, Emily was really there to make sure that the visuals that we were using really accurately represented the technical system, so that we were really being accurate. Corel really helped make sure that the images that we were using were going to be images that resonated locally, and that when we were kind of, it was a pairing of like visuals and a explanation that I was providing, and so to make sure that the language that I was using would also resonate. And then I was there to kind of put the pieces together. And then to your kind of second question about how do we know if they worked, this was one of the things that was maybe the most, really fun and kind of surprising in some of this work. But one of the things that we did when we were providing the explanation is, after I explained each piece of data, I would ask people, how would you use this information to identify somebody who's wealthier or someone who's poor? And many people just kind of got it right away. Like, they'd be like, oh, the person who has more mobile money in their mobile money account, clearly that's the person who would be wealthier. But then the other thing that was really neat is that a lot of people also, on their own, without me prompting in any way, also identified ways in which the data could be inaccurate. So for example, they would say, ordinarily somebody who has more money in their mobile money account would be wealthier, but I often am storing money on my mobile money account for somebody who doesn't have a phone. And so would the system know if that money was intended for me? Or, so there were lots of ways that demonstrated in my mind, a pretty nuanced understanding that really aligns with the ways in which sort of we think about the ways in which the data is and isn't accurate, and doesn't understand sort of local context.
Wow, that's absolutely fascinating, Zoe. And I see you have a question in the Q&A box, but we're going to keep moving along. So you can go ahead and answer that and type your response there. Thank you again, Zoe. Our next presentation is from Micah Carroll. Originally from Italy, Micah graduated with a bachelor's in statistics from UC Berkeley in 2019. His research interests lie in human AI systems, in particular the effects of social media on users and society, and making AI better at complementing and collaborating with humans.
Hello, everyone. I'm Micah Carroll, and today I'm going to be presenting the work that I focused on during my AI Policy Hub fellowship on AI manipulation and recommender algorithms. So recommenders are kind of everywhere in today's world. They are basically the algorithms that determine what kind of items you see when you scroll on social media, what kind of posts you see, I guess, what kind of movies you see when you're on Netflix, products that are recommended to you when you're on e-commerce websites, the music on Spotify, the potential dates on dating apps, and the ads on the websites you visit. But one thing that's kind of understudied in the context of these recommendation systems literature is that user preferences are subject to change, and recommenders themselves, the algorithms, may have incentives to change people's preferences. And this is not just true about preferences, but also for users' moods, beliefs, behaviors, and so on. One development in recent years has been that companies have started optimizing these algorithms for recommendation with a technique called reinforcement learning, or RL. That is the same type of approach that's been used to train AlphaGo and other important advances in AI in recent years. And the purpose of RL agents is to basically modify the state of the world, the state of the environment, in order to get high rewards. And what does that mean in the context of recommendation? Well, the state of the environment, so what the recommender system is interacting with, is our cognitive state, or basically our reactions are the thing that the recommender system itself is trying to modify. So this creates some clear incentives for the recommendation system to try to manipulate the user into engaging more with the content that they're shown, given that the recommender system is being rewarded for keeping users engaged on the platform for longer. And this is something that has been demonstrated by a variety of works at this point, including our own. But mostly the demonstrations have been on a theoretical level of just demonstrating that there will be incentives for manipulation, but they haven't been shown in practice. one question remains of like, okay, can real recommender systems actually manipulate users? And I think there's definitely a variety of evidence that shows that this seems, in fact, quite plausible. As just an example, in 2014, there was this infamous Facebook experiment in which they changed users' timelines just to include happier posts or sadder posts for people. And that was shown to have a significant effect on people's moods and how they were in turn affected to be sadder or happier based on these changes in the timeline. So these systems can definitely affect people in various ways. And insofar as these effects that they can have on users are advantageous to keeping them engaged, when one tries to use a system like reinforcement learning, these systems will automatically discover manipulative pathways for keeping people more engaged, even though they might be exploiting some of these mood changes, belief changes, preference changes that we wouldn't actually want the systems to exploit. And even if these types of manipulations are not actually happening yet today, these theoretical incentives are present, and it seems like a pretty low-hanging fruit for competent systems. And some of our work is actually trying to investigate whether this is happening today already. So one question that we encountered in the course of performing all of this work is what should even count as manipulation in the first place? And this is a definition that we settled on, that basically an AI system is engaging in manipulation if the system acts as if it were pursuing an incentive to change a human or other agent covertly. So this last condition of covertness is important because it gets at this notion of human autonomy or like consent. So if I am aware that the system is changing me in a certain way, and I'm okay with that, then should that count as manipulation? Probably not. Something important about this definition is that it considers even positive changes, such as making me excited or happy or changing my mood in positive ways potentially, as counting as manipulation. If I didn't know that the system was optimizing for inducing these changes in my mood, say. And this, I think, is something that is by design, in the sense that it's a conservative way of being maybe a little bit too encompassing of what should be considered as manipulation, rather than too little encompassing. So in terms of recommendations that might be more useful for broader society, maybe one of the most important insights of this line of work is that manipulation can happen even without designer intent. So yes, we should be worried about misuse and intentional manipulation that individuals might try to enact. But even companies that are, for the most part, trying their best might engage accidentally in manipulation. And some recommendations that we have of what things companies can do in terms of preventing this from happening is, first of all, just increase their transparency, especially for AI systems that interface with humans, and describe in more detail what types of algorithms they're using and how they're using them. And this enables a multitude of parties to basically check that these systems don't have these incentives to manipulate. Related to that, it would be very helpful to have some kind of auditing pathways for companies that are established and permit routine auditing by third-party auditors, like researchers and so on. And more broadly, it seems like manipulation benchmarking standards are needed and should be developed by maybe even collaboratively by researchers, industry professionals, and potentially even regulation officials. So these are the main things that we've done so far, but we hope to have more policy outputs in the next couple of months. And yeah, so I just wanted to thank all of my collaborators, and it's been really great to work with them. And if you want more details, you can see these papers and hopefully more soon enough. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Micah, for that presentation. There's been a lot of talk about the need for increased transparency, especially around recommender systems. And this has happened in the European Union and also in the United States. And your recommendation to be more transparent about the algorithm used. One question I have is, it's great to understand the structure of the algorithm, but that algorithm also operates in a space with humans, right? And there's data around that. How might we be able to foster greater collaboration between platforms and independent researchers who can go in and see how is that algorithm actually operating in practice with human agents?
Yeah, so I mean, it seems like the main way that
platforms internally try to assess this is by doing A/B tests. So basically having two versions of the algorithm, rolling them out in the real world with like different subsets of users, and then I guess comparing the outcomes among these two subgroups. So I don't know, I think like, yeah, the golden standard of auditing pathways that could exist is potentially having companies enable people to do A/B tests, or researchers to do like at least small scale A/B tests, maybe with like some, like definitely with IRB approval and so on. So like just to make sure that the A/B tests are actually, ethical and not doing anything to like anything questionable. But I think like, yeah, if external researchers or third-party auditors of whatever kind had A/B test access, that would be like really revolutionary, I think, for the field of recommendation in academia. Because it's very hard as an academic to actually study recommender systems as things currently are. And like the only people that can really answer the questions fully are the people in the companies themselves, and the incentives are definitely not aligned to explore a lot of questions about harms. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Micah. And I can imagine some regulators also saying, look, if you're doing these A/B tests, let's have some transparency around what actually happened when you tested them. You do have a couple of questions in the chat, but we need to keep moving along. So I invite you to please go ahead and type your answers to those questions. Okay, our next presentation comes from Zhouyan Liu. Zhouyan graduated from Peking University and was a Beijing-based investigative journalist covering technology and politics. Zhouyan also worked in TikTok's global public policy team, the California Office of Digital Innovation, and the Cyber Policy Center at Stanford University. His research interests include empirical studies on China's technology, policy, digital surveillance, and privacy.
Hello, everyone. My name is Zhouyan, and I am a student in the Master of Public Policy program. It's a great honor to present today. My presentation is titled, How AI Technology Changes Authoritarian State Surveillance, with China as the case study. I believe that the Chinese government's large-scale surveillance is not news to you, as it has been widely reported by the media, think tank, and academia. Of course, such surveillance actions raise our concerns about basic human rights and privacy issues. However, I would like to emphasize that surveillance itself is, in fact, one of the oldest political actions of Mein Kampf, not limited to China or the present day. French king once indicated that the essence of ruling is the mastery of information. My question is, when the oldest political practice meets the latest technology, what has changed? What exactly has AI technology changed about surveillance, and what impact has it had? To answer this question, China, with both its authoritarian system and strong technological capabilities, is undoubtedly the best example. I will briefly present the theory. So what do authoritarian countries hope to gain from technology? I think a better description than my own narrative is the Chinese government's own account from an official document I obtained. You can read it yourself. In a nutshell, prevention is better than cure. Today's technological empowered authoritarian rulers want technology to help them solve this major challenge, to detect problems before they arise, to gain a comprehensive understanding of everyone's situation and potential threats before people resist. Based on my investigation and research, I found that the AI surveillance technology helps the government with two issues. First, the manpower needed to collect a large amount of data. And second, the ability to efficiently and comprehensively aggregate data about the same individual from different fields and departments and perform automatic analysis. We come up with two hypotheses. The first is whether AI technology will lead the government's surveillance actions towards a more preventative approach which means intervening in ordering disputes among the general public rather than primarily punishing opponents after the fact. We predict it's the former one. Of course, this does not mean they will stop arresting opponents. It just suggests that the main increment brought by AI technology is not this field. The second question we are interested in is whether such surveillance actions, in terms of effectiveness, are more beneficial to regime security, that is, reducing the number of protests, or to general public safety, that is, reducing ordinary criminal offenses. The latter is also a common rationale for government surveillance. The next section is about using data to empirically test these two hypotheses. Fortunately, the Chinese government had a similar idea as us. They also wanted to test the effectiveness of the AI surveillance technology. When they launched the largest scale technology surveillance project, the Sharp Eyes projects, in 2016, they implemented it in phases. They first selected some pilot cities, marked by red dots on the map, and then expanded the project nationwide in a few years later. This naturally provided us with experimental groups and control groups. In a nutshell, the project involves, on one hand, installing more comprehensive surveillance equipment that reaches deep into rural areas, and more importantly, building an AI-powered data analysis and aggregation platform that compiles various data on each individual and automatically detects potential source of instability. It works in conjunction with grassroots officials to verify the data and address any issues identified. I use the following 4 data items as indicators for my dependent variables. For proactive infiltration, I utilize disputes among the people, which is a concept unique to China. This often involves trivial matters and present the extent of government intervention in the daily lives of ordinary people. For reactive repression, I use the number of arrests of political opponents as an indicator. Obtaining protest data is also challenging, but fortunately, some scholars compile data from Chinese social media to organize information about protests in various regions. For general criminal records related to public safety, the government has published official data. The 4 data items mentioned above are panel data from around 300 cities in China, covering the period from 2011 to 2017. In general, I use a difference in differences model and other statistical methods and conducted several robustness checks. The final results are as follows. The implementation of this AI technology form in pilot cities significantly increased the government's ability to intervene in civil disputes among the people at the 5% level of significance, but did not result in any significant change in the number of political opponents arrested. Additionally, in cities where this project was implemented, civil protests decreased at a significant level, while criminal rates remain unchanged. What does this tell us? Let us quickly return to the 2 initial questions. In other words, the introduction of AI technology has led the government to develop a more preventive approach to monitoring, rather than a reactive one. At the same time, the strengthening of the government capacities has mainly resulted in an increase in political security, rather than public safety. This conclusion is consistent with the qualitative findings I obtained through interviews and government documents. So what implications does my study bring? The implication of the study is first and foremost significant for individuals living in authoritarian countries. It means that in a technology-enabled authoritarian society, even if you do not express any dissatisfactions or protests against the current regime, you're still being monitored automatically by the system. On the other hand, such a system actually has a huge impact on the structure of authoritarian governments themselves. Interestingly, some grassroots officials explicitly told me that they do not like this AI system. Why? Because AI technology takes away the power that originally belonged to them, and decisions and data are made at higher levels. This will be a shock to the entire government structure, and what political consequences they will bring is still unknown. We will wait and see. So, is there anything we can do about the AI-based surveillance that the Chinese government is conducting within its borders? It is clear that we cannot directly influence the Chinese government's decisions. However, I believe there's still hope because the AI industry and surveillance are an ecosystem that includes many other stakeholders. For example, the public, they're obviously influenced by propaganda, and we can try to understand the rule of propaganda. And more importantly, the second is the business community. When the internationalization, they must comply with regulatory requirements in other regimes. The third is scholars. They have dual identities, not only work in authoritarian countries, but also as members of the international community and must comply with their research ethics. My basic view is that the international community should not simply exclude Chinese companies and scholars. If the international community can accept them to work, can accept them under strict supervision, and through a different incentive mechanisms, it will encourage them to work more towards the direction of developing technology that protects human rights and reduce their dependence on authoritarian governments. I advocate for a strict regulatory and cooperatory approach. To conclude, I'd like to end with a classic quote from social biologist Edward Wilson. The real problem of humanity is the following. We have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and godlike technology. He said this decades ago, and it is even more relevant today. I believe this presents both a challenge and an opportunity for us. I hope we can work together to tackle this issue. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Zhouyan. We have a question from one of the audience members thinking about how can we harness this technology to better understand potentially unforeseen instances that we're not aware of. So let me ask a question. In the US, there have been multiple intelligence community problems with the over collection of data. That is, much data goes actually unanalyzed or is analyzed too late after the fact. Do you see any evidence that China is able to overcome those problems with the help of AI?
Thank you. This is a very good question because people often emphasize like how China is strong in AI surveillance and technological capacities. It is true. But also on the other hand, actually during my research and my interviews with some local officials, they also face lots of difficulties. Like, yes, the first is they have lots of data and you need AI technology to analyze it. They're still developing the system. Secondly, it's still very hard to integrate all the data into one platform. They are doing this like the Sharp Eyes project, but they face lots of difficulties because there's lots of political difficulties. Like each department want to like keep the data for themselves, and you need lots of coordination and redistribution of the powers in the bureaucratic system. So I don't see like China has like overcome the problem of analyzing the data, but I might say like China is like the most advanced country in collecting data because there is a less privacy regulation to the government, and also the Chinese people are used to the digitalized life. Like we have like the super app WeChat, and they're like willing to offer some data to the government. So I believe that when they further develop the capacity to analyze the data, they will face lots of political issue, not only technological issue. And this will have like a very interesting impact on the authoritarian system. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much, Zhouyan. We're going to move to our next speaker. Our next presentation is from Angela Jin. Angela graduated from Cornell with a bachelor's in computer science in 2021. Her research interests lie at the intersection of human-computer interaction and machine learning, with a focus on bridging research and practice to build computational tools for scrutinizing algorithmic systems. Through her work, Angela strives to improve equity and access to opportunities for marginalized communities.
Hi, I'm Angela Jin, and today I'll be sharing a little bit about my work in the AI Policy Hub towards responsible use of evidentiary AI in the U.S. criminal legal system. In 2013, Mayor Herskovic, a Hasidic man living in Williamsburg, was convicted of a violent assault. The forensic lab involved in this case used a probabilistic genotyping software, or PGS, to analyze a DNA sample obtained from the victim's sneaker. The software's output concluded that DNA found in the sample likely belonged to Herskovic. This incriminating evidence played a pivotal role in his conviction. However, countless factors pointed towards his innocence. No other physical evidence linked him to the crime, and the PGS tool was never tested on a population as genetically insulated as the Hasidic Jews of Williamsburg. In summary, Herskovic's conviction relied heavily on software that his defense counsel could not scrutinize. And there are many additional concerns with the validity of PGS tools. For example, in multiple court cases, different PGS tools analyzing the same data led to divergent conclusions. Encoding errors in one PGS tool affected dozens of cases in Queensland. These cases have led to many calls for independent assessment of the validity of these software tools, but publicly available information about existing validation studies continues to lack details needed to perform this assessment. Despite these concerns, PGS tools have been used in a total of over 220,000 court cases worldwide, and evidentiary software systems are not just being applied to DNA evidence. Tools have been developed and used for many other applications, such as fingerprint identification, gunshot detection, and tool mark analysis. Given this widespread use and growing concerns for validity, we might ask, what are some existing mechanisms for validation? There are several, but the one I'll focus on today are internal validation studies, which are often pointed to as indicators of PGS validity. Internal validation studies are a series of tests that a lab conducts on the PGS prior to using it in casework. This involves a series of steps that, at a high level, look like what you might see for a large number of other AI systems. A lab analyst will prepare input data, run the PGS system on those inputs, conduct a series of analyses, and publish the results in a summary report to be approved by the lab director. These studies are commonly referred to in courtroom discussions, along with the standards that guide them, as indicators of PGS reliability and validity. But existing standards face several limitations. First, these standards provide ambiguous guidance that leaves key details up to interpretation by individual forensic labs. For instance, the most widely referenced standards recommend that labs test DNA samples characterized by various contributor ratios and provides a few examples without providing any specific ratios the lab should cover or any expectations of ranges to cover. Second, these standards do not account for the technical complexity of these systems. For example, the standards touched upon individual factors that influence PGS reliability, such as the choice of electrophoresis machine used and the amount of input DNA, but do not consider ways in which combinations of these factors may influence reliability. Considering these two limitations, we ask, what would a more rigorous validation study look like? To answer this question, my collaborators and I are creating a testing framework for probabilistic genotyping software. Two questions that we consider, among others, are what data should the test set include? And how should labs measure PGS performance? In this work, our goal is to eventually influence testing requirements that policies implement. While creating more rigorous testing standards will help us move towards more reliable use of PGS in the US criminal legal system, My work also seeks to incorporate defense attorney perspectives into the creation of such testing requirements and policies, especially as policymakers increasingly seek to incorporate perspectives from diverse stakeholders. Defense attorneys are crucial to consider in this work because the US criminal legal system relies on an adversarial system in which the prosecution is tasked with proving guilt and the defense is tasked with disproving the prosecution's case. Defense counsel are the sole actors in the entire legal system with a duty to probe, test, and challenge the prosecution's evidence. So when the prosecution uses evidence output by systems like PGS, defense counsel are often the only actors challenging PGS reliability and can provide crucial insights into current gaps. Consequently, we focus on defense attorneys, and more specifically, public defenders who represent the vast majority of criminal defendants in the US. We ask, what challenges do public defenders face when confronted with AI systems used to produce evidence? To answer this question, my collaborator and I are working towards understanding what challenges public defenders face when confronted with AI systems used to produce evidence, and what information and resources they would need to evaluate reliability. In summary, my research in the AI Policy Hub spans 2 ongoing research projects with collaborators that ask, what would a more rigorous validation of PGS look like? And what challenges do public defenders face when confronted with AI systems used to produce evidence? Together, these projects seek to influence policy as a way to move us towards responsible use of PGS. Consequently, we ask, how do we design policies for testing PGS and reporting test results? In the AI Policy Hub, I've chosen to specifically focus on procurement policy as a path forward. At a high level, before the lab internally validates PGS and uses it in criminal casework, the local procurement office has to purchase the PGS system. Leveraging procurement office's duties to serve the general public and their ability to establish requirements on private PGS vendors, we are working on recommendations for procurement offices that will improve transparency of PGS tools and establish a baseline level of scientific validity that any PGS system must meet before the office signs a procurement contract, bringing important discussions of algorithmic transparency and scientific validity to early stage procurement decisions. As we progress in our research projects, we plan to continue to translate research insights into policy recommendations, including procurement recommendations that I've discussed today. Insights from this research and policy work may also provide valuable insights beyond the US criminal legal system by serving as a case study involving the development of policies and standards implementing performance evaluations of AI systems, and work that jointly considers the computational, social, and political dimensions of AI systems. This concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. I will ask a quick question of you. I mean, these tools are being used currently right now to make decisions in court cases. What do you see as the timeline for there to be that development of standards for assessing the validity of these models?
Yeah, thank you for this question, Brandy. So it is going to take a while, I think, and this is something that we're currently exploring, trying to figure out what the timeline look like. There has been a bill introduced in Congress, which is nice. It was introduced in 2021 by Representative Mark Takano that specifically focuses on computational forensic tools, including PGS, and trying to get that ball rolling. So there is progress, and NIST has also been involved in this recently, but it will take a while in communicating to all the stakeholders and building the foundation to establish rigorous validation.
Great. Thank you so much, Angela. And we're going to move on to our final presentation. I do see that there's a question for you in the Q&A box, so I'll let you go ahead and answer that. Our final presentation is from Cedric Whitney. Cedric is an NSF Graduate Research Fellow, and his background is in leading the deployment of federated machine learning infrastructures in healthcare. His research focuses on using mixed methods to tackle questions of AI governance, including previous work at the Federal Trade Commission on algorithmic disgorgement and at IBM on the right to be forgotten in AI systems.
Hey everyone, thank you all for attending. My name is Cedric Whitney. I'm a third-year PhD student at the School of Information here at Berkeley. My advisors are Professors Deirdre Mulligan and Jenna Burrell, a lawyer and a sociologist respectively, and my background is in machine learning ops and partnerships, specifically at a unicorn healthcare AI company, Anca. Generally, my research is focused on AI governance. I care a lot about how critical work does and does not translate to specific policy and technical implementations. So at the AI Policy Hub, I've been building on some work I was involved in at the FTC. The FTC has ended up in a de facto oversight position in the current consumer privacy-oriented regulatory regime in the US. And while I was there, I was engaged in work around algorithmic disgorgement. So disgorgement is a remedy requiring a party that profits from illegal or wrongful acts to give up any profit that they made as a result of that illegal or wrongful conduct. The purpose of this is to prevent unjust enrichment and to make illegal conduct unprofitable. The FTC recently began using this remedy as a novel tool in settlement with companies that have developed AI products on top of illegally collected data. As a non-FTC example, Clearview recently scraped billions of images of people's faces online without user consent. They used those images to create a facial rec tool that would be used by police to identify and arrest potential suspects around the world. The state of Illinois pushed back and has one of the strictest biometric privacy laws in the country. Clearview AI violated that law when it scraped Illinoisians' images and was required to remove all of the images they had obtained from Illinois residents. So when a company builds a product on top of illegally collected data, just enforcing that they delete that data doesn't actually remove them of the value they derive from it. A model trained on data doesn't suddenly just self-destruct itself post-data deletion. But by requiring that a company also delete the affected work product, algorithmic disgorgement takes aim at the true benefit of illegal data collection in these settings. My research, conducted while at CLTC's AI Policy Hub with Jessica and Brandy's guidance, has been looking at the landscape for use of this tool. The FTC used disgorgement in a settlement with Kerbo that was initiated by a breach of COPPA, which is a federal law that was enacted in 1998 to regulate the collection of personally identifiable data from children under the age of 13. This usage, namely in the enforcement of a federal privacy law, has led many to speculate that disgorgement could be a foundational part of future legislation and regulation around algorithmic systems, and there have been popular calls for disgorgement to be wielded against the creators of large language models for collecting data without consent. I hope to create a resource for policymakers and technologists to better understand what algorithmic disgorgement can and cannot do, both to assist in effective implementation of a remedy that has a lot of promise and to prevent it from being portrayed as a panacea to all algorithmic harm. So in my research, I've identified three major components, all necessary considerations for using this tool outside of its current narrow context. The first is technical capacity. Both on the regulatory side and on the side of the company that is being asked to disgorge, identifying and deleting affected work product is a complex technical problem. Data used to train algorithmic systems is not necessarily siloed in one place. It's often blended with other data and repurposed, and systems are often made up of multiple different intersecting models and data sets. These concerns make it difficult to determine exactly what data was used to develop a given product or service, and to locate and isolate the data that was collected illegally or deceptively. This becomes even more complicated in cases where the data is synthetic or generated, and it can be challenging to trace whether the data is derivative of the illegally collected data. Second, effective enforcement mechanisms are really complicated, with the need for a high level of internal company documentation and logging. This documentation and logging is essential to identify the data that was collected illegally or deceptively, as well as the work product that was developed using that data. However, not all companies have robust internal documentation and logging systems, and that further complicates authentication and audit. Companies must demonstrate that they have successfully disgorged the affected work product, and the FTC or other enforcement bodies must have a way of verifying that the company is being honest. Third, there's a question of scope that must be defined. So disgorgement as an individual right or an extension of the right to be forgotten could result in disconnected outcomes, such as the model being retrained to delete one data point where the impact downstream of that data point on the rest of the model is honestly fairly negligible. So this is still very much a work in progress, but the two main takeaways from it have been as follows. Regarding technical capacity, it should be a priority to increase regulatory funding in order to meet the hiring needs necessary for utilizing this and other governance tools, where there's a high burden on technical capacity to even begin utilizing them in an effective manner. Secondly, harm-based approach that places the burden on developers to demonstrate that their systems are not harmful and that take a similar tack to the EU AI Act and drawing categories of use, such as healthcare data, where that burden of proof is very high, do solve some of these problems, but it's hard to imagine in the current US enforcement landscape one that requires a hook, such as illegal data collection for agencies such as the FTC to act. My hope is that this work will serve as a foundation for understanding the correct context for using this remedy as a policy tool, and that by explicitly considering the above, policymakers will be able to specify when and where algorithmic disgorgement is a useful addition in the AI governance toolbox. Thank you all so much for listening. Happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much, Cedric. Let me first ask a quick question, and we are running up on time. So the use of algorithmic disgorgement, I have also seen that in the European Union, they have used this in alignment with the General Data Protection Regulation. If the US is unable to move forward on this, how might the EU be able to sort of have a spillover effect, that Brussels effect, and put pressure on US firms to do better?
Hey, Randy. Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's two main avenues for that. The first is that the way that the EU AI Act actually approaches different types of data and puts a harm-based burden of proof around, for example, healthcare data, I think is a really strong first step here, even if it just means that companies that are also using US data have to match that EU burden of proof. And then the second is there's avenues for data protection officers under the EU GDPR to also have to kind of enforce some of the data lineage and transparency aspects that are important for enforcement, even in the US context, and how agencies like the FTC or the SEC could actually go about doing disgorgement.
Great. Thank you so much, Cedric. And thank you to all of our fellows. It's been such an honor to work with you over the past year. Thank you for your hard work. And we can't wait to see what outstanding AI policy leaders you will become. And I'll pass it now to my co-director, Jessica Newman.
Thank you, Brandy, and congratulations to all of the AI Policy Hub Fellows for fascinating presentations and such important work. Thank you for all of your hard work and for joining us for this symposium, and thank you to the audience for the great questions. It is now my honor to introduce our final keynote presentation. Pamela Samuelson is the Richard M. Sherman 74 Distinguished Professor of Law and Information at the University of California at Berkeley and a director of the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology. She is an internationally recognized legal expert on the challenges that new information technologies pose for intellectual property law. She's a member of the board of directors of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, as well as a fellow of the Center for Democracy and Technology, and a member of the advisory boards for public knowledge and the Electronic Privacy Information Center. So, Pam, thank you so much for joining us. It is such an honor to be able to hear more about your critical work in the field of AI policy. Apologies that we are running slightly over time, but we can go a little past the hour if we need to, and hopefully folks in the audience can stick around. So Pam, please go ahead when you're ready.
Hi, everybody. I want to start actually by congratulating Brandy and Jessica for their entrepreneurship as in the AI policy space. I think that's actually one of the best things I've encountered at Berkeley. So thank you for your leadership and your entrepreneurship. If they hadn't raised the money for these AI policy fellows, you guys wouldn't be doing this particular work. So you owe a great deal to them. But I also want to congratulate the six of you for fascinating presentations about your research projects. I think that Stuart was really correct in saying a problem in getting good regulation in this space is that policymakers, even if they're well-intentioned, and not all of them are, but even if they're well-intentioned, they don't actually know anything about technology. And so for them, AI is just this black box. And it's not really a black box that they have any way of really unpacking. On the other hand, the AI researchers, again, assuming that they're well-intended, don't know anything about policy and don't know kind of what the policy levers are out there. And so these two communities are really they need to work together. And what they really need is people like you. So I want to encourage you to continue work in this space. There's certainly going to be jobs for people who are able to essentially integrate technology knowledge and also policy expertise. And so each of you has just gotten away from all of the AI hype out there and really focused your attention on things that you can do that make a difference and that can really move the ball forward on explainability, on accountability, on test validations and the like, because that's what's really needed. I mean, if you look at I think Stuart said 300 high-level agreements about AI policy, what you see is that everybody wants to say, oh, yes, of course, there should be a careful risk assessment and mitigation of risk, and oh, it's important for there to be transparency, and oh, it's important that things be explainable and contestable, and it's important to respect privacy and other human rights, and including non-discrimination principles. But the problem is that it's easy to reach consensus at this very high level of generality and very difficult to get it down to here's what you can actually do on a day-to-day basis, because even things in the AI Act, which is the biggest effort right now to do some regulation, they want to say that everything has to be developed. Standards need to be developed for training, validation, and testing so that the systems are relevant, representative, free from error and completeness. There are no such standards right now. And so putting in place a law that requires something that can't be done is really not such a great idea. So I think the Europeans, again, they like to think that they can think things out in advance and then everybody will comply. But I think that we need something that's a little bit more flexible and that sort of recognizes that the state of AI is going to continue to evolve, and it's going to be necessary to sort of figure out what are really practical ways to achieve some degree of transparency. So I think that auditing, which came up a little bit today, I think auditing requirements are going to be important. But again, we don't have any standards right now for what a good audit might look like. Another idea that's very practical is to sort of make sure that when an AI system is making a recommendation, that in fact you know that you're interacting with an AI system and not just with individual decision-making by agencies or by companies, and the idea of providing some access for researchers to be able to do some independent testing of the accuracy of these systems is something, again, I expect will happen over time. But one thing I want to say is that even though you look at the US right now and it doesn't really have much in the way of AI regulation, there are lots of agencies that, in fact, will be enabling some sort of regulation. So the FAA is going to be regulating the use of AI in airplanes. At least I hope so. The FDA probably in the use of AI in medical devices. Courts can still adjudicate product liability. So we may need some special rules, but there are lots of laws already on the books that will apply to AI. We just haven't been thinking about that. We sort of think about AI as just this, oh, it's this thing out there and it needs its own regulatory regime. No, it doesn't. It may need some special rules, but it doesn't need everything. But I think everybody should be able to go get lunch. So I think I'm going to cut my remarks short. And again, thank you, Brandy and Jessica, for your entrepreneurship and for your leadership on these issues. I've learned so much from you.
Thank you so much, Pam, for a great keynote presentation. We really appreciate the kind sentiments and encouragement and having the opportunity to learn from your expertise in the space and really about the importance of adopting existing laws. So that does bring us to the end of our event today, but we want to thank all of our speakers and everyone online for joining us. We have covered a lot of ground in the AI policy space today, from surveillance to AI-enabled government services, to procurement guidelines and legal options for redress, and so much more. It's a pleasure to share some of the great work happening at the AI Policy Hub and across UC Berkeley with you all, and we hope you'll keep in touch with us and these amazing fellows. For any UC Berkeley graduate students who are tuned in, please do consider applying to be part of next year's cohort. The program is open to graduate students across any discipline and department. And we can put the link in the chat now for the call for applications. The deadline to apply is next Friday, April 28th. So with that, I will pass it back to Rachel. Thank you again for joining us for the first annual UC Berkeley AI Policy Research Symposium. Take care, everyone.
Awesome. Thank you, Jess. And thank you, Brandy. Thank you very much once again to Stuart and Pam for sharing their expertise in those keynotes. And one more virtual round of applause to our inaugural cohort of Policy Hub Fellows. Thank you for sharing your fascinating work with us. And finally, thank you to everyone in the audience for attending today, asking some really thoughtful questions. We're really grateful that you spent this part of your day with us. And we look forward to doing it again next year. So stay tuned. I'll just close out with this final slide of some ways to stay in touch. We have the link here, the bit.ly link there that takes you to more information about the application for the next cohort of AI Policy Hub Fellows. So take a look at that. And yeah, we've got Jess and Brandy's contact info here should you have any questions that you can't find on the site. But that's it. In the meantime, hope you all have a great rest of your day. Until next time. And thank you again for joining us today. Take care.